Welcome to Last Minute Lecture. This free chapter overview is designed to help students review and understand key concepts. These summaries supplement, not replace, the original textbook and may not be redistributed or resold. For complete coverage, always consult the official text. You know, when you think about running a marathon, I haven't actually run one.
Right, me neither.
But, everyone focuses on the finish line, the cheering, the sheer relief that it's over. But for anyone who actually runs them, they know the moment you stop running is when the real systemic shock sets in.
Oh, absolutely. The lactic acid dumps, the muscle spasm.
Right. Your temperature regulation just goes completely haywire, and you suddenly realize the recovery might be, just as intense as the race itself.
That is actually the perfect framing for our deep dive today. Because for a nursing student, childbirth feels like the big event.
The finish line.
Exactly. But in obstetrics, that finish line is really just the gateway to the puerperium, the fourth trimester. We're talking about the critical 6 weeks where a mother's body undergoes these massive, rapid physiological shifts.
And returning to its pre-pregnant state, which is our mission today for you, the listener, in this last-minute lecture format. We're doing a comprehensive, step-by-step deep dive directly into Chapter 10, from Lifer's Introduction to Maternity and Pediatric Nursing.
Yes, because understanding this foundational physiology isn't just about, memorizing facts for your exams. It is the absolute basis for your clinical reasoning on the floor.
Right, because if you don't know the exact mechanism of what is expected, you will completely miss the abnormal complications.
You'll miss them until it's an absolute crisis. You have to anticipate the physiology to prioritize safe interventions.
So let's jump in. But before we even touch, the physical assessments, we have to establish the context of the patient in the bed.
Very true. You are never just treating a contracting uterus. You're treating a person whose demographics and cultural background directly impact their clinical outcomes.
Like an adolescent mother, for instance. That requires a totally different nursing strategy than a 35-year-old multipara.
Completely different. A younger adolescent might be incredibly passive in her own care. She's, still developmentally focused on peer validation.
So your intervention isn't just handing her a pamphlet.
No, it's finding ways to help her fit in with her peers while simultaneously teaching her these critical parenting skills.
On the flip side, you might have a single mother whose primary clinical risk isn't even physiological, it's psychosocial.
Right, like a severe lack of support or immense financial pressure to return to work before her body has even healed.
And what if you're caring for a family that just had multiples? Those challenges compound exponentially, right?
Oh, massively. There's a much higher risk of preterm birth, which brings NICU stays into the equation, delaying vital bonding. And psychologically, parents of multiples often struggle initially to view the babies as distinct individuals.
Wait, really? How so?
Well, they might just refer to them as a set. So as a nurse, modeling behavior by constantly calling each baby by their specific name is a subtle but really powerful intervention.
Wow, that's such a great detail. We also have to navigate how clinical protocols intersect with cultural beliefs, like the hot and cold dietary theory.
Yes, this is a classic example in the text. If you have a postpartum patient refusing ice water and demanding only room temperature or hot water,
and they want specific foods like eggs and chicken, it can confuse a nurse who isn't culturally competent.
The clinical key here is understanding that hot and cold rarely refer to the physical temperature of the food. It's about the believed intrinsic properties of the food.
Right, because childbirth is often viewed as a cold condition.
Exactly, due to the loss of blood, which is considered hot. So the patient is trying to restore equilibrium. They might also seek a balance between yin foods, like bean sprouts, and yang foods, like broiled meat.
And unless a cultural practice is actively harmful, our job is just to accommodate it, right?
Yes. Facilitating these practices makes the birth experience emotionally meaningful and builds immense trust.
Okay, so once we understand their context, our immediate clinical priority shifts to the most dramatic physiological event happening: uterine involution.
The body has to manage this massive wound left behind by the detachment of the placenta.
I always visualize the contracting uterus as this natural internal tourniquet. You have these exposed bleeding blood vessels, and the uterine muscle fibers have to clamp down violently.
Like living ligatures. When you assess the fundus, the upper uterus, immediately after delivery, you're palpating for a firm, grapefruit-sized mass right at the umbilicus.
And the diagram in the chapter shows it dropping about 1 centimeter or 1 finger's width every single day.
Yes. By day 10, it has descended so far into the pelvis that it shouldn't even be palpable abdominally. If it fails to do this after 6 weeks, we call that subinvolution,
which requires medical intervention. But let's look at a scenario you will absolutely see in clinicals. You press down to assess the fundus, and instead of a firm grapefruit, it's a soft, boggy mass.
And it's pushed way over to the right side of the abdomen?
Right. If you picture the pelvic anatomy, there is only one reason the uterus is displaced.
The bladder. The uterus and the bladder share very tight quarters. During the puerperium, the mother experiences massive fluid shifts and diuresis, rapidly filling that bladder.
So if it gets distended, it physically forces the uterus up and out of alignment, which means those muscle fibers can't clamp down effectively.
That's exactly the danger. A deviated, boggy uterus due to a full bladder puts the patient at severe, immediate risk for postpartum hemorrhage.
So your intervention pathway is massage the fundus to control the bleeding first, then immediately assist the patient to empty her bladder.
Yes, whether by ambulating to the bathroom or using a catheter if necessary.
Let's break down skill 10.1, the fundal massage. Because doing it wrong is incredibly dangerous. You position the patient supine, knees flexed.
But the absolute most critical step, the one you can never ever forget, is placing your non-dominant hand firmly just above the symphysis pubis.
You have to anchor the lower segment of the uterus.
You must anchor it. If you use your dominant hand to forcefully massage a boggy fundus without anchoring the bottom, you could cause uterine inversion.
Pushing the uterus inside out.
Yes, which is a catastrophic, life-threatening emergency. The anchoring hand is totally non-negotiable.
Now, while the uterus is doing all this contracting, the patient definitely feels it. We call these after pains. And the text notes they are significantly worse in multiparas.
Right, because the uterine musculature has been stretched out across multiple pregnancies. A primipara usually maintains a steady, firm contraction.
But a multiparas uterus has less tone, so it constantly relaxes and then has to spasm forcefully, causing sharp pain.
And those after pains flare up intensely during breastfeeding because of the endocrine system. When the baby suckles, the posterior pituitary releases oxytocin,
which we usually just associate with milk letdown.
Right, but it is a potent stimulator of smooth muscle. It forces the uterus to contract, which is brilliant for preventing hemorrhage, but painful for the mom.
Alongside palpating the fundus, you're visually assessing the lochia, the vaginal discharge. The progression tells you exactly how the placental site is healing.
So for the first 3 days, you expect lochia rubra. It's dark red, very blood heavy.
Then days 3 to 10, it transitions to lochia serosa, right?
Mm-hmm. A pinkish or brownish mix of blood and mucus. And then from day 10 up to 21, it becomes lochia alba, which is clear or white.
We meticulously track the volume using a pad saturation chart. Like scant is a stain less than 2 inches in an hour.
Light is less than 4 inches. Moderate is less than 6. And large is saturating a pad in about 2 hours.
But the massive red flag is excessive bleeding.
Saturated in 15 minutes or less. That is an immediate emergency.
Moving down, we assess perineal healing using the RETA acronym. Redness, edema, ecchymosis, discharge, and approximation.
You're checking how well those episiotomy or laceration edges are pulling together.
Okay, so all this fluid loss and trauma triggers a cascade of systemic changes. Let's talk about the cardiovascular shifts. If I see a white blood cell count spiking to 20,000, my first instinct is to panic about an infection.
Which is why context is everything. In a normal adult, 20,000 is alarming. But early postpartum is just an expected inflammatory response to the extreme physical stress of childbirth.
So you don't automatically assume infection?
No, you look for corroborating signs. Primarily a sustained fever above 100.4 degrees after the first 24 hours.
Got it. Another cardiovascular shift. Blood clotting factors remain highly elevated for 4 to 6 weeks. It's an evolutionary defense against hemorrhage, but it creates a massive risk for thrombophlebitis.
Blood clots in the lower extremities. Now, the traditional BBLEHE assessment includes H for Homan's sign.
Pain on foot dorsiflexion, right?
Right. But current guidelines note its diagnostic value is actually quite limited because mothers often have strained leg muscles from pushing.
So our primary intervention is a thorough visual and tactile assessment, inspecting the calves for redness, warmth, and unilateral swelling.
Exactly. Now let's shift to the urinary and GI systems. Because of 5E fluids and a sudden drop in hormones, the body initiates massive diuresis.
But the bladder tone is decreased and the epidural might still be wearing off.
So she might have a rapidly filling bladder but feels zero urge to void.
Which leads right back to urinary retention threatening uterine involution. So as the nurse, you meticulously measure those first 2 to 3 voids.
to ensure the bladder is actually emptying and not just overflowing.
And the GI system is just as sluggish. Constipation is almost guaranteed, progesterone drops, muscles are stretched, and they're terrified to push a bowel movement.
So your nursing fixes are very proactive. Push fluids, increase dietary fiber, encourage early ambulation, and administer prescribed stool softeners like DocuSit.
Before we leave maternal changes, we have to talk about the immune system, the ROJAM protocol.
Yes. If you have an Rh-negative mother who delivers an Rh-positive newborn, her immune system might have been exposed to the baby's blood.
And her body will treat it like an invader, creating antibodies.
Sure.
It won't hurt this baby, but in future pregnancies, those antibodies will cross the placenta and attack an Rh-positive fetus.
To prevent this sensitization, you have a strict, non-negotiable 72-hour window to give the ROJAM IM injection.
It temporarily suppresses her immune response before those permanent antibodies form.
Now, how does all this change if the patient has a C-section?
Right. I mean, isn't it just the standard postpartum checklist plus checking a surgical wound?
Not at all. The clinical priorities really shift. Yes, you use Rita for the incision, but the respiratory and GI systems are far more compromised. Interestingly, lochia volume is generally less initially.
Because the surgeon physically swabs out the uterine cavity, removing blood and tissue?
Exactly. But the pain is intense, which limits mobility. You'll often see PCA pumps where the lockout interval prevents overdose.
And your teaching needs to be highly targeted. Because of the incision, she won't want to cough or take deep breaths.
So you instruct her to physically splint her incision with a small pillow. This counterpressure significantly reduces the sharp pain.
Which gives her the security to actually clear her lung secretions and prevent pneumonia. Oh, and catheter removal, you monitor until she spontaneously voids at least 150 milliliters.
Healing the physical body is demanding, but it's only half the battle. The psychological transition dictates her ability to safely care for the newborn. We use Rubin's psychological phases.
Think back to the marathon analogy. Phase 1 is taking in. You're passive, exhausted, focused entirely on food and sleep.
And recounting the birth. Crucially, in this phase, she is not ready to learn complex new skills.
But then she transitions into the taking hold phase. She becomes intensely interested in newborn care.
That is your prime teachable moment for bathing, feeding, and cord care.
And finally, letting go. Reconciling the fantasy birth plan with reality and giving up previous lifestyles. It's an emotionally turbulent time.
Which is why we draw a sharp clinical line between postpartum blues and postpartum depression.
The baby blues are expected, right? A transient period of rapid mood swings and conflicting feelings of joy and letdown.
Right, it resolves naturally. Postpartum depression, however, is a persistent, overwhelming unhappiness and apathy. It does not resolve on its own and requires immediate reporting.
We also have to address caring for grieving parents in the event of fetal loss. The nursing role shifts entirely to protective empathy.
Validating their loss while shielding them from institutional insensitivity.
You provide a memory packet taking physical footprints, maybe a lock of hair. And crucially, you implement a door code, like a flower on the door.
That immediately alerts all hospital staff so no one walks in cheerfully asking about the baby. It protects them from explaining their trauma to strangers.
As the mother stabilizes, we move to phase 2, newborn care. The immediate priority is thermoregulation. Newborns are terrible at keeping heat.
They lack the shiver reflex, have thin skin, and rely on metabolizing brown fat, which burns immense energy.
We defend against 4 mechanisms of heat loss. Evaporation is heat lost as moisture turns to vapor, which is why we aggressively dry the baby off.
Conduction is heat lost through direct contact, like placing a naked newborn on a cold, unwarmed scale.
Convection is heat lost to moving air, like an AC vent. And radiation is losing heat to a nearby cold object, like a window, even without touching it.
Once temperature is stabilized, security protocols take over. And there is a fascinating rule regarding ID bands. You never ask a tired mother, is your band number 1234?
Because she might just nod yes to make you go away.
Yeah.
You have to physically compare the numbers on the baby's band directly to the mother's band, every single time.
Next is the gestational age assessment. Is the skin transparent, meaning preterm, or peeling, meaning post-term?
Are the sole creases only on the top third or all over? Does the breast tissue measure 5 millimeters?
Then we gather vitals. Normal heart rate is very fast, 110 to 160. Respirations are 30 to 60. But the invisible threat is hypoglycemia.
A newborn's brain consumes massive amounts of glucose. Once the cord is clamped, blood sugar naturally plummets. We monitor this via a capillary heel stick.
And the anatomical diagram is vital. You only ever puncture the shaded, fleshy areas on the outer lateral and medial sides of the heel, never the center.
If you hit the center, you risk hitting the plantar nerve or the calcaneus bone, causing a severe bone infection. The goal is a blood glucose greater than 45 milligrams per deciliter by 2 hours.
We must also perform mandatory metabolic screening, like the PKU test, done strictly between 24 and 48 hours of life.
PKU is an inability to metabolize a specific amino acid in protein, causing severe intellectual impairment if missed. But if tested at birth, it's negative because they haven't ingested protein yet.
Exactly. They need to feed for at least 24 hours to give the amino acids time to build up to detectable levels.
With the baby stable, we actively facilitate bonding. We look for attachment behaviors like high-pitched voices and skin-to-skin contact.
And the end face position, that direct eye-to-eye contact, right at that 8 to 12-inch focal distance newborns have.
Which brings us to the physiology of lactation. I like to explain this reflex arc as a factory and a delivery truck.
Oh, I like that analogy.
When the baby suckles, the anterior pituitary releases prolactin. Prolactin is the factory. It produces the milk. But the milk needs a mechanism to get out.
That's where the posterior pituitary comes in. It releases oxytocin, the delivery truck. It triggers the letdown reflex, squeezing the milk down into the nipple.
And the milk evolves rapidly. First is colostrum. It's thick, yellowish, low volume, but packed with antibodies and acts as a laxative for meconium.
Then it transitions, becoming mature milk by about day 14. It has a thinner, bluish tint. Mothers panic, thinking it looks like skim milk.
But you reassure them it provides a perfect 20 kilocalories per ounce. You also have to teach them proper latching, like breaking suction with a finger to avoid nipple trauma.
And how do they know the baby is getting enough? Look for an audible swallow and softer breasts post-feeding. But the absolute gold standard is 6 to 8 wet diapers a day.
If they're formula feeding, a critical safety alert. Parents must never prop the bottle.
It creates a severe risk of aspiration and long-term dental caries.
Which brings us to discharge planning. You must teach the parents the danger signs. A fever over 100.4, heavy bleeding, or calf pain.
And for you, the nursing student, use the BBLEHE mnemonic for your assessments. B is for breasts.
U for uterus, checking the fundus. B for bladder output.
B for bowels, anticipating constipation. L for lochia volume.
E for episiotomy healing.
H for Homan sign, keeping those visual calf checks in mind. And E for emotions and bonding.
And visually confirm car seat safety rear facing in the back seat. To our nursing student listener, you have got this. Thank you from the Last Minute Lecture team for letting us help you prep.
Before we wrap up, I want to leave you with one final thought. The postpartum microbiome.
Oh, let's hear it.
When you intervene as a nurse, when you dim the lights for sleep, fiercely protect skin to skin, and encourage breastfeeding, you aren't just completing a checklist. You are actively shaping the bacterial colonies that will govern that infant's brain-gut communication.
Wow.
You are helping build an immune and metabolic foundation that could dictate that child's health for the rest of their adult life.
The finish line of birth truly is just the starting line. Best of luck on your exams.